Hey there, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're diving deep into one of the most powerful emotions that all of us experience, yet often struggle to understand and control: fear. But here's the twist. What if I told you that fear doesn't have to hold you back? What if I told you that fear could actually be your greatest ally on your path to personal greatness and transformation? You see, when we think about fear, we often think about avoiding it, running away from it, or even being paralyzed by it. But today we're going to explore two very different, yet profoundly insightful ways that two of history's greatest philosophers, Friedrich Nietzsche and Baruch Spinoza, approach fear, and how you can apply their philosophies to live more boldly, more authentically, and with much less anxiety. We'll look at how Nietzsche sees fear as a tool for growth, a challenge to be conquered, not avoided, and how Spinoza, on the other hand, suggests that we dissolve fear by understanding it through reason. By the end of this video, you'll have a powerful framework for handling fear in your own life, allowing you to unlock potential you never thought possible. But before we jump into these life-changing insights, I've got one simple request. If you're enjoying this content so far, or feel like you could benefit from these lessons, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more transformative content like this. And if you're feeling extra generous, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks to help keep this content coming your way. Every bit helps, and I truly appreciate your support. All right, enough of the intro. Let's dive into how you can turn fear from a paralyzing force into the ultimate source of power. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll look at fear completely differently. Fear has been ingrained in human existence since the beginning of time, shaping behavior, decisions, and even societal structures. In ancient times, fear was a survival mechanism, protecting early humans from predators, natural disasters, and other life-threatening dangers. A heightened sense of caution ensured the continuation of the species. But in the modern world, where physical threats have significantly diminished, fear has evolved into something more abstract. Today, people are rarely running for their lives from wild animals. Yet fear persists, manifesting in different forms. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of uncertainty, and even fear of success. These fears are often not external dangers, but rather self-imposed mental constructs, limiting personal growth and fulfillment. A common question arises. If many of the threats that triggered fear in our ancestors no longer exist, why do we still experience it so intensely? The answer lies in our evolutionary biology. The human brain, specifically the amygdala, is wired to detect threats and trigger fear responses. This was once an advantage, keeping our ancestors vigilant. However, today, that same biological mechanism often misfires, interpreting non-lethal experiences like public speaking or making a career change as life-threatening situations. The result is that fear holds many people hostage, preventing them from stepping outside their comfort zones and taking risks that could lead to personal and professional growth. Imagine a person who dreams of becoming an actor but is terrified of performing in front of an audience. Logically, they know that stepping onto a stage will not cause any real harm. But the fear of being judged or failing can be so overwhelming that they never take the first step. This type of fear is not about survival. It's about the fear of embarrassment, inadequacy, or losing status in the eyes of others. The same principle applies to someone hesitating to start a business, ask for a promotion, or pursue a relationship. The fear isn't based on a real, immediate threat. It's rooted in self-doubt and perceived consequences. This is where philosophy becomes a valuable tool. Friedrich Nietzsche and Baruch Spinoza, two of the greatest minds in history, offer different yet complementary approaches to dealing with fear. Nietzsche's philosophy encourages overcoming fear through sheer willpower, facing it head-on, and emerging stronger. He believed that struggles and challenges were not obstacles, but essential components of human growth. To Nietzsche, fear should not be avoided, but embraced as a sign that one is pushing beyond their current limitations. He advocated for the concept of a more fatty, or the love of fate, which means accepting and even welcoming all aspects of life, including hardship and fear, as necessary parts of becoming stronger. A classic example of Nietzschean philosophy in action can be seen in sports. Consider a boxer training for a championship fight. Fear of losing, of getting injured, or of public failure looms over them. A Nietzschean mindset would dictate that rather than allowing that fear to cripple them, they should use it as motivation, train harder, become tougher, and embrace the fight as an opportunity to test their strength. Through this process, fear is not eliminated but transformed into a powerful driving force. Spinoza, on the other hand, takes a more analytical approach to fear. He argues that fear arises from ignorance, and that by understanding the root cause of fear, one can detach from it. In his view, emotions like fear are simply part of the human experience, but they should not be allowed to control one's actions. Instead, they should be examined rationally. Unlike Nietzsche, who emphasizes direct confrontation with fear, Spinoza suggests that knowledge and self-awareness help dismantle irrational fears. Think of someone who has a deep fear of flying. Statistically, air travel is one of the safest forms of transportation, but for many, the idea of being thousands of feet above the ground in a confined space is terrifying. A Spinozist approach to overcoming this fear would involve educating oneself about aviation safety, understanding the mechanics of how planes work, and perhaps even speaking with pilots or aerospace engineers. By gaining more knowledge, the unknown becomes familiar, and fear loses its grip. In the context of business, many aspiring entrepreneurs hesitate to start their ventures due to fear of failure. While Nietzsche would encourage them to charge forward despite their fears, Spinoza would suggest breaking down the fear logically. What exactly are they afraid of? Financial loss? Embarrassment? What are the actual risks, and how can they be mitigated? Through logical assessment, many of these fears would be revealed as exaggerated or even unfounded, allowing the individual to move forward with greater clarity. Both approaches offer valuable insights. Nietzsche's philosophy is beneficial for those who thrive on challenge, who need an external push to overcome hesitation. His ideas resonate with individuals who see life as a battle that must be fought with courage and determination. Spinoza, however, provides an intellectual pathway for those who prefer a more calculated, introspective method of handling fear. His philosophy is ideal for individuals who want to understand fear at its root, detach from unnecessary anxieties, and operate from a place of calm rationality. In practice, the most effective way to overcome fear may be a combination of both approaches. There are moments when fear must be tackled head-on, as Nietzsche would advise, and moments when fear must be deconstructed and analyzed, as Spinoza suggests. A person learning to swim, for example, might benefit from Nietzschean action, jumping into the water and confronting their fear directly. At the same time, they could benefit from Spinozist logic, understanding the physics of buoyancy, practicing breathing techniques, and gradually easing into the process. Society often reinforces fear through conditioning. People are taught to fear failure, social rejection, or stepping outside the norm. From a young age, individuals are warned about taking risks. What if you don't get a job? What if you embarrass yourself? What if people don't like you? These fears become internalized and shape how people approach life. Nietzsche challenges this mindset by urging individuals to break free from societal expectations and embrace their unique paths, no matter how unconventional. He warns against living a herd mentality, existence one dictated by the fears and opinions of others, because true fulfillment comes from pursuing one's own greatness, regardless of societal norms. Spinoza would argue that these fears stem from external influences and that once individuals recognize this, they can liberate themselves. Fear, in this sense, is not an inherent personal trait, but rather a learned response shaped by environment and upbringing. If one becomes aware of this conditioning, they can begin to detach from it and make choices based on reason rather than fear. Consider the rise of social media and how it amplifies fear of judgment. Many people curate their lives to fit societal expectations, fearing that a misstep or an unpopular opinion will lead to rejection. Nietzsche would encourage people to post what they truly believe, regardless of the reaction. Spinoza would advise recognizing that social validation is not a necessary component of self-worth. Both perspectives ultimately lead to the same conclusion. Fear should not dictate one's actions. The most successful individuals, whether in business, art, or personal development, are those who learn to manage and transcend fear. The difference between someone who succeeds and someone who remains stuck is not necessarily talent or intelligence, but the ability to push past fear. The musician who performs despite stage fright. The entrepreneur who takes a chance despite financial risk. The activist who speaks up despite potential backlash. These are people who embody the teachings of Nietzsche and Spinoza in action. Fear is unavoidable, but it does not have to be limiting. Whether one chooses to face it with Nietzschean strength or dismantle it with Spinoza's logic, the goal is the same. To move forward unshackled by unnecessary fear, embracing life with courage, wisdom, and a deeper understanding of what it means to truly live. Fear is one of the most powerful forces that shape human behavior, but it is also one of the least understood. It operates not just as an instinctual reaction, but as a deeply embedded psychological and social construct that dictates how people navigate their lives. Fear can be protective, alerting individuals to danger, but in most modern cases, it becomes a paralyzing force, preventing action, growth, and self-realization. To overcome fear, one must first break it down into its fundamental components, understanding how it operates at different levels of human experience. Existential fear is perhaps the most universal and deeply rooted form of fear. It stems from humanity's awareness of mortality and the uncertainty of existence. Since the beginning of civilization, people have struggled with questions like, why are we here? What happens after death? Is there any meaning to life? These questions create a level of existential anxiety that can be overwhelming. This is why religions, philosophies, and even cultural myths have historically played such an essential role in shaping human belief systems. They provide a framework that alleviates existential dread. However, for those who struggle with these fears outside of a religious or philosophical structure, it can manifest as a constant undercurrent of anxiety. Many people attempt to suppress it by immersing themselves in distractions, whether through work, entertainment, or material possessions. The fear of meaninglessness leads to a desperate need for validation, success, or legacy, as individuals seek to justify their existence in the face of an uncertain future. Social fear is more immediate and tangible, as it is tied to one's place within a group or society. Humans are social creatures by nature, and the fear of rejection, humiliation, or being judged by others is deeply ingrained in the psyche. This fear is evident in everyday life, from the anxiety of speaking in public to the hesitation in expressing controversial opinions. The power of social fear is so strong that it often dictates people's behavior, even when it contradicts their true desires. Many remain in unfulfilling careers because they fear disappointing their families. Others stay silent in situations of injustice because they fear the backlash of social condemnation. Social media has exacerbated this fear, as people are constantly aware of how they are perceived by an audience, leading to the pressure of maintaining a curated version of their lives. The fear of rejection and judgment can be so intense that it prevents individuals from pursuing their passions, taking risks, or forming meaningful connections. Personal fear is more individualized, relating to a person's internal struggles with inadequacy, pain, or loss. This fear often emerges from past experiences, failures, or trauma, shaping how individuals view themselves and their potential. A person who has experienced failure in a particular area of life, such as business or relationships, may develop a deep-seated fear of trying again. The pain of past rejection may lead to avoidance of new relationships. The fear of losing something valuable, whether it's a job, a loved one, or financial stability, can create a tendency to cling to the familiar, even when it is no longer beneficial. This is why so many people remain in toxic relationships or environments they fear that leaving will be worse than staying, even when the situation is clearly detrimental. Fear operates as a silent force that controls lives without individuals fully realizing it. It dictates choices, often leading people to settle for mediocrity rather than risk failure. It prevents people from taking leaps of faith that could lead to transformation. A talented musician may never pursue their craft seriously because they fear they won't succeed. A writer may keep their work hidden because they fear criticism. A person may avoid traveling, changing careers, or expressing their true beliefs because they fear the unknown. Fear creates an illusion of safety, convincing people that inaction is the better option, even when it leads to dissatisfaction. One of the most damaging aspects of fear is how it reinforces stagnation. When people allow fear to dictate their actions, they stop growing. They become trapped in cycles of avoidance, which only serve to strengthen the fear over time. The more someone avoids confrontation with their fears, the larger those fears become. Consider a person who fears public speaking. Each time they avoid speaking in front of others, their anxiety around the situation intensifies. The fear is not resolved, it is reinforced. This principle applies to nearly every form of fear. Avoiding risk prevents the experience necessary to build confidence. Avoiding discomfort prevents the personal evolution that comes from overcoming challenges. Fear is also socially reinforced, making it even harder to break free from. Society sets unspoken rules about what is acceptable, what is desirable, and what is shameful. Fear of failure is particularly ingrained in cultures that emphasize success as a measure of worth. The pressure to achieve leads to a reluctance to take risks. People fear not meeting expectations, not being good enough, or being perceived as a disappointment. There is also a fear of success, where people are hesitant to step into their full potential because it comes with responsibility, pressure, and the risk of losing what they have already built. Additionally, nonconformity is often met with resistance. Fear of standing out, of being different, or of challenging the status quo can keep people from pursuing unique paths. Many great thinkers, artists, and innovators face this fear when presenting ideas that went against conventional wisdom. Galileo challenged the dominant scientific beliefs of his time at great personal risk. Writers and activists throughout history have faced exile, imprisonment, or worse for speaking the truth. This fear of breaking from societal norms continues to shape decisions today. Nietzsche and Spinoza both recognize that true freedom begins with dismantling fear. Nietzsche takes a bold stance, arguing that fear should be confronted and conquered. He saw fear as something to be overcome through willpower and self-mastery. He believed that life is about struggle and that through struggle, individuals become stronger. His philosophy encourages people to act in spite of fear, to push beyond their limitations, and to embrace challenges as opportunities for growth. He warns against living in a passive state, controlled by the fears imposed by society or one's own mind. In his view, to live in fear is to live in weakness. He challenges people to develop what he calls the will to power, a force that drives individuals to transcend fear and become their most powerful selves. Spinoza, by contrast, approaches fear with logic and understanding. He argues that fear arises from a lack of knowledge. If people understood the true nature of what they fear, they would no longer be controlled by it. He believed that emotions like fear could be deconstructed through reason, and that once fear is understood, it loses its hold. Spinoza's approach is more methodical rather than charging through fear like Nietzsche. He suggests studying it, breaking it down into rational parts, and dissolving it through awareness. Both perspectives offer valuable insights. Nietzsche's approach is useful for those who need a push to take action, while Spinoza's approach helps those who feel trapped in their own thoughts and anxieties. A person who is afraid to start a new project might benefit from Nietzsche's philosophy, simply taking the leap and forcing themselves to act. Another person, who is anxious about an uncertain future, might find relief in Spinoza's method, examining their fear logically and understanding that uncertainty is not inherently dangerous. To overcome fear, people must first recognize the extent to which it controls their lives. They must acknowledge that much of what they fear is not real danger, but imagined consequences. They must learn to separate rational caution from irrational hesitation. If fear is not challenged, it grows. If fear is confronted, it shrinks. By embracing Nietzsche's courage and Spinoza's clarity, individuals can begin to live with greater freedom, stepping out of the shadows of fear and into a life defined by action, understanding, and self-determination. Nietzsche believed that fear was not an enemy to be avoided, but a challenge to be confronted and mastered. Unlike conventional perspectives that treat fear as a weakness or an obstacle to be removed, Nietzsche saw it as an opportunity, an indication of where growth and transformation could occur. To him, life itself was a struggle, and through struggle, individuals had the chance to develop strength, resilience, and power. He rejected the idea of passivity in the face of fear and instead promoted the concept of self-overcoming, the process of actively pushing beyond one's limitations to become something greater. His philosophy of amor fati, or the love of fate, encapsulates this approach. Rather than fearing hardship or resisting life's difficulties, one should embrace everything that happens as necessary and meaningful. The events of life, both good and bad, are not obstacles but essential components of one's development. A warrior stepping onto the battlefield does not shrink away from the possibility of death. Instead, they accept it as part of the path they have chosen. In doing so, they achieve a higher level of strength, not just physical, but mental and existential. The same principle applies in daily life. When facing failure, rejection, or uncertainty, the Nietzschean response is not to avoid these experiences, but to welcome them as necessary trials. They are not signs of weakness, but invitations to build strength. The concept of will to power further reinforces this. Nietzsche did not believe that true power came from avoiding challenges. Instead, power came from actively engaging with them and using them as fuel for growth. Fear, in this sense, is not something to be suppressed, but something to be transformed. Every moment of hesitation, every feeling of doubt, is an opportunity to exercise one's will to assert control over one's own life and direction. Those who embrace fear and push through it develop a level of power that those who surrender to fear never will. This is why Nietzsche admired figures who lived with boldness and intensity, great warriors, artists, and thinkers who refused to let fear dictate their choices. A clear example of this idea can be seen in an artist struggling with stage fright. A musician who dreams of performing but fears judgment has two choices. They can allow fear to control them, staying in the background and avoiding risk, or they can confront their fear by stepping onto the stage. Nietzsche would argue that only the second choice leads to personal transformation. The moment the musician plays their first note in front of an audience, they have asserted their will to power. They have taken an experience that once threatened to paralyze them and turned it into a source of strength. It does not matter if the performance is perfect. What matters is that they have actively chosen to face the fear rather than submit to it. This principle applies beyond the arts. Consider an entrepreneur who hesitates to launch a business due to fear of failure. Many people dream of starting something of their own, yet they hesitate because of the risks involved. They fear financial loss, public failure, or the unknown challenges that come with stepping into new territory. A Nietzschean response to this fear would be to view it not as a reason to retreat, but as a reason to move forward. If something induces fear, it is likely because it represents an area of untapped potential. By embracing the challenge, The entrepreneur is not just risking failure, they are asserting control over their own future. Each decision to act, despite fear, is a step toward greater self-mastery. Nietzsche's philosophy can also be applied to relationships. Many people fear vulnerability in personal connections. They avoid expressing their emotions or admitting their feelings because they fear rejection or emotional pain. But Nietzsche would argue that love, like any other aspect of life, requires boldness. A person who is afraid to love, afraid to take emotional risks, remains stagnant. True connection requires the willingness to expose oneself, to embrace the possibility of pain as part of the journey. Just as a warrior must face battle and an artist must face an audience, those seeking meaningful relationships must be willing to confront their own fears of intimacy and openness. In modern society, fear often dictates people's choices without them realizing it. People remain in unfulfilling jobs because they fear uncertainty. They avoid pursuing their dreams because they fear judgment. They conform to expectations because they fear standing out. Nietzsche would see this as a failure of will, a life driven not by one's own desires, but by avoidance of discomfort. To him, the highest form of existence is one in which fear is acknowledged, but never allowed to control one's actions. Those who succumb to fear live half-lives, shaped more by what they avoid than by what they seek. In contrast, those who confront fear live fully, embracing both triumph and struggle as equally valuable parts of the human experience. An example that many people can relate to is the fear of public speaking. Surveys have shown that public speaking is one of the most common fears, often ranked higher than the fear of death. People dread standing in front of a crowd, being judged, making mistakes. And yet, those who master public speaking are often the ones who achieve the most influence. Politicians, business leaders, and thought leaders all had to push through the same fear. The only difference between those who succeed and those who remain paralyzed is their response to fear. A Nietzschean approach would be to step onto the stage again and again, embracing the discomfort until it no longer holds power. Nietzsche's rejection of fear also applies to societal expectations. Many people structure their lives based on what is considered safe or acceptable rather than what they truly desire. They take paths that feel secure rather than ones that ignite passion. Nietzsche would challenge this as well. He believed that society conditions people to fear the unknown, to prioritize comfort over greatness. But true self-overcoming requires a willingness to break from convention. Those who achieve the most, whether in art, science, or personal fulfillment, are those who refuse to let societal fear dictate their choices. A powerful real-world example is the story of Steve Jobs. Jobs was fired from Apple, the company he co-founded, in a humiliating and very public way. Many would have retreated in defeat, allowing the fear of failure to consume them. But Jobs embraced the challenge. He saw failure not as the end, but as part of his journey, and he returned to lead Apple to unprecedented success. This is Nietzschean thinking in action, the willingness to embrace hardship, use it as fuel, and emerge stronger. Nietzsche's ultimate message is that fear is a doorway to self-mastery. Those who turn away from fear remain in the same place, unchanged. Those who step through it discover new levels of strength and possibility. Every challenge, every doubt, every hesitation is an invitation to grow. The only way to truly live is to accept that fear will always be present, but to never let it dictate one's path. Instead, one must use it as a signpost, pointing to the places where transformation is waiting to happen. Spinoza's perspective on fear is rooted in rationality. Unlike Nietzsche, who viewed fear as a force to be confronted with sheer will, Spinoza saw fear as a result of misunderstanding. To him, fear is not something to be conquered by force, but something to be dissolved through knowledge and reason. People are afraid not because fear is an inherent and inescapable condition, but because they do not fully understand what they fear. If they did, fear would lose its power. Spinoza believed that most fears are based on assumptions, exaggerations, and distortions of reality. Once we analyze them, break them down, and examine their true nature, they become manageable or even disappear entirely. This explains why so many fears dissipate once people gain experience. Consider a child who is afraid of the dark. The fear is not really about darkness itself, it's about the unknown, the possibility that something dangerous might be lurking in the shadows. As they grow older, they realize that the darkness does not contain hidden monsters, and the fear disappears. The same principle applies to adulthood, though in more complex ways. People fear public speaking because they assume an audience will judge them harshly. They fear financial investments because they don't understand how markets work. They fear flying because they lack knowledge about aviation safety. In every case, the fear is not based on reality, but on a lack of understanding. Once someone learns the mechanics of how things work, their fear is replaced by confidence or at least a rational assessment of risk. Spinoza introduces the concept of conatus, which describes the natural tendency of all beings to strive for self-preservation and well-being. Fear arises when something appears to threaten this drive for survival. However, Spinoza argues that most of these threats are not real, but perceived. The mind magnifies dangers, interpreting uncertainty as immediate risk. If a person fears losing their job, for example, it is not necessarily because they will end up in absolute poverty, but because their mind has exaggerated the consequences. The reality may be that they have skills, connections, and alternative options, but their fear does not allow them to see this rationally. Spinoza would say that by analyzing the situation logically, they would realize that the fear is disproportionate to reality. An entrepreneur is a perfect example of how knowledge can replace fear. Many people dream of starting a business, but hesitate because they fear failure. They imagine worst-case scenarios, losing money, facing humiliation, or being unable to recover. However, those who study business models, market trends, and financial management gradually begin to see entrepreneurship in a different light. Instead of perceiving risk as a looming disaster, they view it as a calculated equation, something that can be managed and mitigated. Spinoza would say that their fear was simply a product of ignorance. As they gain more knowledge, their anxiety decreases. What once seemed like an insurmountable risk becomes an informed decision. This is the power of reason. By understanding fear, we weaken its grip. Fear also thrives on ambiguity. When people are unsure of an outcome, they tend to assume the worst. This is evident in health anxieties. A person who experiences an unusual physical symptom might immediately jump to the conclusion that they have a serious illness. Their mind spirals into fear, imagining scenarios of suffering and death. However, a doctor who has knowledge and experience does not panic when seeing the same symptom. They assess it based on medical facts and probabilities. In most cases, what seemed like a dire emergency turns out to be minor. The fear was never rooted in reality. It was a byproduct of uncertainty. Spinoza's approach suggests that when we lack knowledge, our minds fill in the gaps with fear. The best way to combat this is to seek information, question our assumptions, and replace speculation with facts. Fear of failure is another prime example. Many people hesitate to take risks because they fear failing. But failure itself is not inherently dangerous. What matters is how one interprets it. In many cases, failure is a learning experience, a step toward improvement rather than an endpoint. Spinoza would argue that those who fear failure misunderstand its nature. They see it as permanent rather than as a temporary obstacle. This is why some of the most successful individuals in history have been those who embraced failure as part of the process. Thomas Edison famously failed thousands of times before inventing the light bulb. If he had succumbed to fear, he never would have succeeded. His success was not due to an absence of fear, but to an understanding of failure as a necessary step in discovery. In Spinoza's terms, he replaced emotional fear with logical analysis. Spinoza also recognized that fear is often manipulated by external forces. Governments, media, and corporations frequently use fear to influence behavior. Political campaigns emphasize threats to security. News outlets highlight worst-case scenarios. Advertisements play on insecurities, suggesting that without a particular product, a person will be unattractive or unsuccessful. Spinoza would argue that much of this fear is manufactured, designed to keep people in a state of anxiety so they can be controlled. The antidote, again, is knowledge. Once people recognize that fear is being used as a tool to manipulate them, they can detach from it. They can question the narratives being presented and think independently. Spinoza's philosophy is especially relevant in an era dominated by social media. The constant exposure to curated versions of other people's lives can create fears of inadequacy. People fear they're falling behind, not achieving enough, or not living as exciting a life as their peers. But these fears are based on illusions. Social media presents a distorted version of reality, highlighting successes while hiding struggles. If one analyzes this rationally, they will see that comparing themselves to an incomplete picture is irrational. By recognizing this, they can detach from the anxiety it creates. One of the most liberating aspects of Spinoza's philosophy is that it offers a way to live without unnecessary fear. He does not suggest ignoring genuine risks, but rather distinguishing between rational caution and irrational anxiety. Rational caution involves assessing risks logically and taking appropriate measures. Irrational anxiety involves exaggerating threats and allowing them to dictate behavior. If someone is afraid of flying, a rational response would be to study flight safety statistics and perhaps take gradual steps to become comfortable with the experience. An irrational response would be to avoid flying entirely without examining whether the fear is justified. Spinoza teaches that by understanding fear, people gain the power to act based on reality rather than emotion. A final example of Spinoza's philosophy in action is seen in relationships. Many people fear commitment because they are afraid of being hurt. They hesitate to trust, fearing betrayal or disappointment. But Spinoza would argue that this fear is based on past experiences or hypothetical scenarios rather than the present reality. If someone approaches a relationship with fear, they may sabotage it before it even has a chance to grow. However, if they approach it with rational awareness, recognizing that every relationship carries some risk, but also great potential, they can engage more fully. Understanding the nature of emotional experiences allows people to navigate them more effectively rather than being ruled by fear. Spinoza's core message is that fear is often an illusion, created by a lack of understanding. Once we seek knowledge, analyze situations rationally, and separate real risks from imagined dangers, fear loses its control over us. True freedom comes not from avoiding fear, but from dissolving it through reason. When people embrace this perspective, they begin to make decisions based on clarity rather than avoidance. They stop seeing fear as a barrier and start seeing it as a problem that can be solved. They stop running from what they do not understand and start learning about it instead. This is Spinoza's ultimate path to freedom, replacing fear with knowledge, uncertainty with understanding, and anxiety with rational thought. Nietzsche and Spinoza offer two distinct paths for overcoming fear, each shaped by their unique philosophical perspectives. Nietzsche sees fear as something to be confronted directly, a force that must be challenged and transformed into strength. He believes that struggle and hardship are not obstacles, but necessary conditions for growth. Spinoza, on the other hand, approaches fear through rational analysis. He views fear as a misunderstanding, a byproduct of incomplete knowledge. Instead of fighting it head-on, he suggests that by understanding the root of fear, one can dissolve its power and neutralize its effects. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power suggests that fear is not something to be avoided or suppressed, but a signal that one is at the edge of personal growth. When fear appears, it means there is an opportunity to transcend limitations. He would encourage a person to step into the discomfort, to see fear as an initiation into a higher state of being. This applies to everything from career ambitions to personal relationships. A person who hesitates to start a new venture out of fear is, in Nietzsche's view, failing to exercise their will. The only way to grow is to push through that fear, to act despite it, and to emerge stronger. Spinoza, by contrast, does not frame fear as a battle. Instead, he sees it as a problem to be understood. He believes that people fear what they do not fully comprehend. A person who is afraid of speaking in public is not necessarily afraid of speaking itself, but of judgment, failure, or embarrassment. If they analyze these fears rationally, they will realize that most of them are based on assumptions rather than reality. Spinoza's approach is not about forcefully confronting fear, but about dissecting it until it no longer holds power. In this way, he sees fear not as a challenge to be overcome, but as an illusion that disappears once fully understood. Nietzsche's method works well for those who thrive on challenge and action. It appeals to people who see life as a battle, where strength is gained through struggle. Athletes, entrepreneurs, and risk-takers often resonate with this perspective. Consider a boxer stepping into the ring. There is always fear of pain, of losing, of public failure. But a Nietzschean mindset would embrace that fear. The fighter would not try to analyze it away or suppress it, but rather use it as fuel, transforming anxiety into intensity and focus. Spinoza's method is better suited for those who prefer calm, analytical detachment. It appeals to thinkers, planners, and those who prefer rational control over their emotions. Consider a scientist facing a difficult problem. Instead of panicking or charging into the unknown, they break the issue down logically, piece by piece. They study the facts, gather data, and let reason guide their actions. A Spinozist approach to fear is about removing the emotional weight from it and treating it as another variable to be examined and understood. Both methods have their strengths and weaknesses. Nietzsche's approach is energizing, but it requires an active, confrontational mindset. It works well for those who respond to pressure with action. However, for those who are naturally more cautious, forcing confrontation with fear can sometimes create more resistance. Spinoza's method, on the other hand, is calming and rational. It allows a person to gain clarity and reduce unnecessary anxiety. However, for some, the analytical approach can lead to overthinking, which may delay action. A balance between the two may be the most effective approach. Fear should not be ignored or suppressed, but it should also not be confronted recklessly. Nietzsche teaches us to face it with courage, while Spinoza teaches us to understand it before acting. A person facing a major life decision, whether to quit a job, move to a new city, or pursue a relationship, could benefit from both perspectives. They could first use Spinoza's method to analyze their fears rationally, breaking them down into real and imagined risks. Then, they could adopt Nietzsche's mindset to push forward despite uncertainty, embracing the challenge as part of their growth. In real-world scenarios, we see these two approaches at play constantly. A person afraid of investing in the stock market might take Spinoza's route first, studying market trends, learning about financial risks, and ensuring they have knowledge before making a decision. But at some point, they must also take Nietzsche's approach, acting despite residual fear, accepting that there's always some risk involved, and using that risk as motivation rather than an excuse for inaction. Social fears also illustrate this contrast. Imagine someone who wants to become a writer but fears public criticism. A Spinozist approach would involve logically breaking down this fear, understanding that criticism is inevitable, that negative feedback does not define a person's worth, and that most successful writers have faced rejection. But after this intellectual understanding, a Nietzschean step is necessary. The writer must eventually publish their work, take the risk, and confront whatever comes. Spinoza provides clarity, Nietzsche provides action. Ultimately, both philosophies aim for the same goal: freedom from fear. Nietzsche's path is through struggle. Spinoza's is through knowledge. Some situations demand one more than the other, but in most cases, a combination of both is the most effective. Fear should be faced, but it should also be understood. It should be analyzed, but not endlessly. The key is knowing when to apply which mindset, when to step back and examine, and when to step forward and act. Those who master this balance can navigate life with both wisdom and courage, ensuring that fear neither controls them nor holds them back. Fear is an unavoidable part of life, but how we deal with it determines the trajectory of our experiences. Nietzsche and Spinoza provide two different but complementary ways of handling fear, one through action, the other through understanding. Nietzsche's approach is about facing fear directly, seeing it as a challenge to be overcome rather than an enemy to be avoided. Spinoza's approach is about understanding fear at its core, deconstructing it rationally so that it loses its power. In real life, both methods can be applied in practical ways, depending on the nature of the fear and the personality of the individual experiencing it. A Nietzschean approach requires exposure to fear, instead of running from what makes us uncomfortable. Nietzsche would argue that we must deliberately step into situations that challenge us. The more we expose ourselves to fear, the more we develop resilience. Consider someone who has a fear of public speaking. A Nietzschean strategy would involve repeatedly putting themselves in situations where they must speak in front of others, each time pushing past the discomfort. Over time, they will become desensitized to the fear, not because public speaking becomes inherently less intimidating, but because they have learned to handle the discomfort. This principle applies to any area of life where fear is a barrier, whether it's starting a business, making social connections, or pushing through physical limitations in athletic training. To Nietzsche, the world is a battleground, and fear is an opponent that must be confronted head-on. Adopting a warrior mindset means seeing fear not as a warning sign to retreat, but as an indicator of where growth happens. The gym is a perfect metaphor for this. When a person lifts weights, the body resists at first, but with consistent effort, the muscles grow stronger. Nietzsche would argue that fear operates in the same way each time we push against it. We build psychological strength. A person afraid of rejection in relationships, for example, might benefit from putting themselves in social situations repeatedly until the fear diminishes. Each rejection becomes less painful, and confidence grows in its place. Nietzsche would also emphasize the importance of constantly raising the bar. Many people become complacent because they fear change. They stay in comfortable but unfulfilling jobs, avoid difficult conversations, or settle for mediocrity because it feels safe. But Nietzsche believed that true power comes from never allowing oneself to remain stagnant. Someone who follows this philosophy will continuously seek new challenges, pushing their boundaries both personally and professionally. This can mean taking on leadership roles at work, learning a new skill, or traveling alone to an unfamiliar country. The goal is not just to overcome a single fear, but to cultivate a mindset where fear is no longer a limiting factor. Spinoza takes a different approach, favoring reason over raw confrontation. His strategy begins with breaking down fear logically. Instead of reacting emotionally, he suggests analyzing the situation with a critical mind. This can be done by asking, what is the worst that can happen? Most fears, when examined rationally, turn out to be less catastrophic than they initially seem. Someone who fears quitting their job might imagine themselves homeless and destitute, but a logical analysis would show that they have savings, alternative career options, and a support network. By addressing fear through reason, a person can remove the exaggerated narratives that make fear feel so overwhelming. Knowledge is a crucial tool in Spinoza's strategy. Many fears stem from uncertainty, and uncertainty is often the result of ignorance. The more one knows about a subject, the less intimidating it becomes. A person afraid of investing money, for example, might assume it's too risky because they don't understand how financial markets work. But by reading about investments, speaking with financial advisors, and learning basic principles of risk management, their fear transforms into informed decision-making. Similarly, a person afraid of flying can study statistics about airline safety, watch videos explaining how turbulence works, and gradually replace their fear with understanding. Spinoza would argue that knowledge is the antidote to fear because fear thrives in the unknown. Another key aspect of Spinoza's approach is emotional detachment. Fear often has power because it triggers a strong emotional response, making it feel bigger than it actually is. Spinoza suggests stepping back and viewing fear as a natural but non-threatening phenomenon, much like how a scientist observes a reaction in a laboratory. This doesn't mean ignoring fear, but rather seeing it objectively. Imagine someone nervous before a big job interview. Instead of getting lost in self-doubt, they can remind themselves that nervousness is a natural response, that the worst-case scenario is manageable, and that even rejection is just one step in a larger journey. By detaching from the emotional intensity of fear, they prevent it from paralyzing them. The practical applications of these philosophies are everywhere. A student afraid of failing an exam could take the Nietzschean approach, repeatedly testing themselves under difficult conditions to build confidence. Or they could take Spinoza's approach, breaking down the fear logically and studying smarter rather than stressing. A person who wants to switch careers but hesitates out of fear could follow Nietzsche's method of jumping into discomfort head-on, or Spinoza's method of thoroughly researching the transition until the fear is neutralized. Both perspectives have merit, and their effectiveness depends on the individual and the situation. Some people are naturally more inclined toward action, making Nietzsche's approach more effective. Others prefer understanding before acting, making Spinoza's method a better fit. In many cases, a combination of both is ideal. For example, an athlete preparing for a major competition might use Spinoza's strategy, first studying their opponents, planning a training regimen, and logically assessing their strengths and weaknesses. But when it's time to compete, they shift into Nietzschean mode, embracing the struggle, confronting their fears directly, and pushing through discomfort with sheer determination. Fear is universal, but it doesn't have to be limiting. Nietzsche teaches that fear can be a guide, pointing toward areas of potential growth, while Spinoza teaches that fear can be dismantled with knowledge and rational thought. Whether someone chooses to fight their fears head-on or deconstruct them with logic, the goal remains the same: to live without being controlled by fear. When people take these philosophies and apply them to their own lives, they begin to act with greater confidence, take more meaningful risks, and develop a sense of freedom that is only possible when fear no longer dictates their decisions. Living authentically is one of the most profound human aspirations, and both Nietzsche and Spinoza provide philosophical frameworks for how to achieve it. At the heart of their philosophies is the idea that fear, particularly irrational fear, is the primary force that holds people back from living their true selves. When fear dominates, people make choices based on what they think is safe or expected, not on what they truly desire or what they know deep down is right for them. To live authentically is to strip away these layers of fear and illusion, allowing one to act freely and genuinely in the world. Nietzsche's conception of authenticity is rooted in his idea of living boldly, embracing risk, and chasing one's own greatness. He believed that every individual has the potential to achieve greatness, but that potential can only be realized through struggle and overcoming challenges. Authenticity, in Nietzsche's eyes, is not about following the herd or living according to societal expectations, but about embracing what makes one unique. It's about the courage to take risks, to go after what truly excites and fulfills, even when it means facing failure or criticism. For Nietzsche, authentic living involves embracing life in its entirety, including its hardships. He believed that every challenge, every obstacle, and every failure could contribute to one's growth. The act of pursuing greatness is not simply about succeeding. It's about the process of pushing yourself beyond your limitations. An athlete, for example, lives authentically when they push beyond their physical limits. They face the pain, the exhaustion, the fear of injury, and continue anyway, knowing that the very act of doing so transforms them. Authenticity, in this sense, is about pushing through discomfort in order to grow, to test the boundaries of what is possible, and to become the person you are meant to be. Take the example of an entrepreneur who risks failure to pursue their dream. The fear of financial loss, of rejection, of being seen as a failure by others is powerful. But authenticity means living with courage, even in the face of those fears. When an entrepreneur starts a business, they put themselves at risk of failure, risk of criticism, and risk of not achieving the success they imagine. But Nietzsche would argue that the entrepreneur is living authentically in the truest sense when they step into that arena, embracing the unknown and pushing forward despite the potential for failure. Success is not the ultimate marker of authenticity. The willingness to act in accordance with one's deepest desires and aspirations is what defines a truly authentic life. Similarly, someone leaving a toxic relationship, despite the uncertainty it brings, is also living authentically in Nietzsche's view. The fear of loneliness, the fear of making a mistake, the fear of an uncertain future all contribute to the hesitation. But Nietzsche would argue that living authentically requires courage to take the necessary steps to ensure one's own well-being, even when those steps involve risk. Staying in a relationship that no longer serves you simply because of fear is a form of self-betrayal. Nietzsche would emphasize that authenticity involves breaking free from what holds you back, including toxic relationships, to pursue a life aligned with your true self. On the other hand, Spinoza's idea of authenticity is more grounded in wisdom, seeking truth and maintaining inner peace. While Nietzsche's authenticity is about boldness and risk-taking, Spinoza's authenticity involves a deeper understanding of the self and the world around us. He believed that true freedom comes from understanding the nature of the world and our place within it. By understanding the forces that shape us, including our emotions and fears, we can live more rationally and peacefully. Authenticity, for Spinoza, is not about embracing chaos or struggle, but about achieving harmony with the world and living with clarity and reason. In Spinoza's view, the more one understands about their own nature and the nature of reality, the less they are swayed by fear or irrational emotion. Spinoza's authenticity is about emotional intelligence and rational detachment. When you understand that fear is often based on misconceptions or exaggerated perceptions, it loses its power. You don't live in reaction to fear or anxiety, but rather in alignment with knowledge, reason, and inner peace. This kind of authenticity allows a person to live wisely, free from the turbulence of irrational fears or social pressures. Take, for example, a person who practices mindfulness or meditation in order to maintain a sense of peace despite external challenges. This person might face difficulties, stress at work, conflicts in relationships, or existential doubts, but their authenticity comes from their ability to understand their own emotional responses and choose how to react. Rather than being swept up in fear, they approach each situation calmly, making decisions based on reason and clarity rather than emotional turmoil. They are not ruled by fear or anxiety, but guided by understanding and inner peace. In a more everyday example, consider someone who is afraid to speak up in a meeting at work. If they follow Spinoza's model of authenticity, they would first examine the fear. Why are they afraid? Is the fear based on rational concerns, such as not being prepared to contribute? Or is it based on a fear of judgment or rejection from others? Spinoza would suggest that by rationally analyzing these emotions and realizing that most fears are based on misunderstandings or unfounded anxieties, the individual can then approach the situation with calmness and confidence. Authentic living in this case means not letting fear dictate their actions, but acting based on rational understanding and wisdom. The most profound form of living authentically, according to both Nietzsche and Spinoza, is to act with courage and clarity. Nietzsche's courageous approach to living authentically often involves embracing fear and struggle as parts of the process, whereas Spinoza's more peaceful approach involves understanding fear, detaching from it, and responding from a place of calm. Both philosophers are, in essence, seeking to free the individual from the limitations imposed by irrational fear. For example, in the context of a person pursuing their life's work, whether that's writing, art, or entrepreneurship, both approaches are crucial. A person must first have the courage to follow their passion despite the fear of failure or judgment, a Nietzschean approach. At the same time, they must also cultivate the ability to detach from the fears that are not based on real threats, but rather on imagined outcomes, a Spinozist approach. Authentic living in this sense is about pursuing one's passions with both the boldness to act and the wisdom to understand the nature of the fears that might arise along the way. To live authentically is to embrace who you are, to make decisions based on your values and aspirations, not on fear or social expectations. It requires courage to step into the unknown, to face rejection and failure, and to embrace discomfort as a necessary part of growth. It also requires wisdom to understand the root causes of fear, to detach from irrational anxieties, and to choose actions that align with your deeper self. Authentic living, in both Nietzschean and Spinozist terms, means living fully, free from the illusions that fear creates, and stepping into a life that is driven by clarity, purpose, and true self-expression. An athlete pushing beyond their physical limits, an entrepreneur taking the risk to chase their dream, but in pursuit of their true potential. In each case, authenticity means facing life's challenges directly, making decisions that reflect one's true values, and embracing both the discomfort and the growth that comes with stepping beyond the limitations of fear. It is in these moments of courage and clarity that authenticity is fully realized, allowing individuals to live the life they are meant to lead. Fear, in its many forms, is something that every individual grapples with throughout their life. Whether it's the fear of failure, rejection, or the unknown, fear can often seem like an insurmountable barrier standing between a person and their potential. However, both Nietzsche and Spinoza, two of the most influential philosophers, offer ways to transcend this fear, each advocating for a different approach. Nietzsche's philosophy challenges us to confront fear directly, to transform it into a driving force for power and growth. On the other hand, Spinoza's philosophy encourages us to understand fear rationally, to dissect it and neutralize it through knowledge and clarity. In this complex dance between action and understanding, we can find a way to live freely, boldly, and authentically. Nietzsche's philosophy is deeply rooted in the idea that life is a struggle, and in that struggle, one's greatest potential is realized. For Nietzsche, fear is not something to run from, but to embrace. Fear, in his view, is a signpost pointing toward growth. It is an indication that you are at the edge of your current limitations, and that is where the opportunity for expansion lies. He teaches that in order to truly live, to become something greater than what we are, we must confront our fears head-on. This might mean stepping into situations where failure is a possibility, but Nietzsche would argue that failure itself is not the enemy. It is merely a stepping stone toward greater strength. Fear, for Nietzsche, is a test one that must be passed through action, through courage, and through the sheer force of will. One of the most empowering aspects of Nietzsche's approach is the concept of amor fati, or the love of fate. This idea proposes that we should not only accept the challenges and obstacles life throws our way, but embrace them fully, instead of seeing difficulties as burdens. Nietzsche challenges us to see them as opportunities for growth. A person who faces a personal crisis, like the loss of a job or the end of a relationship, could either collapse under the weight of fear or take Nietzsche's advice to heart. Embrace the difficulty, see it as part of the process of becoming stronger, and move forward with resolve. This perspective transforms fear from a negative emotion into a catalyst for action and growth. For example, consider an athlete preparing for a competition. There's a great deal of fear involved: fear of injury, fear of failure, fear of embarrassment. But Nietzsche would say that this fear should be welcomed. It's the very presence of fear that indicates the potential for growth. By facing the challenge, by stepping into the arena, and confronting the unknown, the athlete is not just competing for a medal, but is also undergoing a profound process of self-overcoming. This is the core of Nietzsche's philosophy, the process of becoming, of pushing oneself beyond the limits set by fear and growing stronger as a result. Spinoza, in contrast, offers a more intellectual approach to fear. Rather than confronting fear with boldness and willpower, Spinoza teaches us to understand fear, to break it down through reason, and in doing so, to neutralize its power over us. Spinoza sees fear as a form of ignorance. When people fear something, it is because they do not fully understand it. Fear arises from uncertainty, from the unknown. And the mind often fills in the gaps with exaggerated scenarios and worst-case outcomes. For Spinoza, understanding is the antidote to fear. By logically examining the source of fear, we can separate real risks from imagined ones, and in doing so, regain control over our emotions. A prime example of Spinoza's approach can be seen in the fear of public speaking. Many people experience intense anxiety at the thought of speaking in front of an audience. Yet this fear is rarely based on real danger. By analyzing the situation logically, one can see that the worst possible outcome is rarely catastrophic. Perhaps the audience might not respond well, but this does not equate to personal failure or even true harm. Spinoza would suggest that by gaining a clear understanding of the situation, by realizing that fear is often based on irrational assumptions, the speaker can detach from the emotional intensity of the fear and approach the situation with greater clarity and calm. Both Nietzsche and Spinoza offer valuable lessons for the modern individual. Nietzsche's approach of facing fear directly and using it as a source of power is essential for those who thrive on challenge and action. His philosophy encourages boldness, courage, and the willingness to embrace discomfort as a necessary part of growth. However, Spinoza's philosophy is equally important, especially for those who prefer a more intellectual, reflective approach. Spinoza teaches that by understanding the root of fear, by examining it logically and rationally, one can reduce its hold on the mind and approach life with greater emotional stability and clarity. The key to transcending fear in the modern world is not to adopt one philosophy over the other, but to integrate both approaches. The modern individual must learn to face challenges boldly, as Nietzsche suggests, but they must also learn to detach from unnecessary anxieties, as Spinoza advises. Fear is often a product of misperceptions, and by understanding where fear comes from and why it exists, one can reduce its power. At the same time, there are moments when the only way to grow is to act in spite of fear, when the fear itself is the very thing holding us back from realizing our potential. Imagine a life where fear no longer dictates your decisions. What could you achieve if you no longer feared failure, rejection, or the unknown? What would your life look like if you could embrace every challenge as an opportunity to grow rather than a threat to your safety or self-worth? The truth is that your greatest potential lies just beyond your deepest fears. It is in the moments when we step into discomfort, when we challenge ourselves to push past our limits, that we experience the most profound growth. Both Nietzsche and Spinoza remind us that fear is not something to be feared, it is something to be understood, confronted, and ultimately transcended. By embracing fear, we open the door to mastery, to living fully, and to becoming the person we are meant to be. And there you have it, two radically different, yet equally powerful ways to conquer fear and live authentically. Whether you lean more toward Nietzsche's bold, action-oriented approach or Spinoza's calm, rational detachment, The key takeaway is clear. Fear does not control you unless you let it. Both of these philosophies offer a roadmap to a life that's truly yours, unburdened by irrational anxieties and the constraints of fear. And now, it's your turn to take that first step. Whether it's facing that public speaking engagement, chasing your dream career, or leaving a toxic situation, remember fear is not something to fear. It's a signal, a call to grow and become the person you were meant to be. If you found value in today's video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so that you never miss out on more tips, strategies, and deep dives into how you can live a life of authenticity and power. Your support means the world to me, and if you feel moved, don't forget to drop a super thanks as a way to support the channel further. It helps keep content like this coming and helps me bring even more value to you. And one last thing before you go. Imagine a life free from the grip of fear. What would you achieve if you could take on life's challenges with courage and clarity? You are closer to that life than you think. And it all starts with understanding fear, embracing it, and using it as fuel for your greatest potential. Thank you so much for watching. Keep pushing your limits, keep growing, and, as always, stay authentic. See you in the next one.